So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy once again to moderate this side event on the mainstreaming of biodiversity in development policies. And we will see how the research can contribute to develop cross-functional public action. The idea this afternoon is to illustrate how research can act with some example of the ECOPRONAT research program. So what is it, this ECOPRONAT research program? It's a program for a pro-nature economy, and we will explain afterwards what it is, developed and financed by IFD. IFD is the French Agency of Development. That's the company where I'm currently working. It aims to develop knowledge and methodology to integrate biodiversity into the policies and various areas of intervention, first of all, of our group, IFT group, but also to mobilize financial resources to strengthen the capacities of researchers of the South and to provide support to change to IFD partners. This program is structured around several activities: research work, call for research projects, support for researchers, and also support for pro-nature project sponsors in different sectors, such as city and agriculture, among others. This session, we will discuss the links between biodiversity and sustainable development policy through the presentation of 3 research initiatives supported by the program, experiences and tools. There are more than 3 research programs, but we choose these three ones today. The session will address the following subthemes: alternative and nature-based solution for sustainability challenges, including perspective from indigenous people, mainstreaming biodiversity into existing public policies from national to local level and scaling up mainstreaming, and finally, an approach to quantify natural environment to inform and help decision-making. So our 3 researchers will present briefly their research projects, and they will then share what happened behind the scene, I would say. It's not a presentation of 10 minutes of the research program. We choose to do that on another way, to present very shortly the research program. That's a challenge in 2 minutes. And afterwards, to answer some question of what happened during the design of the program, how they worked with partners, how it's possible to scale up, and so on. So a discussion and not a series of presentation. I hope it will be okay for all of you. So the session will take the form of a moderated discussion, as I said before, with the 3 panelists. So now I will present the 3 panelists. And it's my pleasure to introduce Alison Ferbos. Alison, you got PhD in urban sustainability and resilience at the University College in London. And you are currently lead researcher from University College in London, Institute for Sustainable Resource in London too, and you are the lead of the SGAP Strong Sustainability Approach in Colombia and South Africa. And that's a program you will describe to us afterwards. I won't say what it is. Lisa Beyer, you are a landscape architect and an urban planner, and you are currently manager for urban water infrastructures at the WRI, the World Resource Institute, and lead researcher for the project Strategic Nature-Based Solution Framework, Rapid Citywide Assessment and Identification of Suitable NBS in Kigali and Addis Ababa. And Nicolas Salmon, you are an architect, yes? Engineer. I search on internet by training, and a sustainability researcher. You are currently the CEO of Yes Innovation, based here in Quito. And you are the lead researcher for the project Enabling NBS Scale-Up in Latin American Cities. So ladies and gentlemen, I will ask you to present your research program now as I said, in 2 minutes, a real challenge for researchers. And so we will begin with you, Alison. And you will present what is this ESCAP, Strong Sustainability Approach in Colombia and South Africa.
Gracias. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So yes, I am presenting about a project about the Environmental Sustainability Gap Framework. So this is a framework of around 20 indicators, which is based on the strong sustainability concept. So all indicators are supported by science-based reference levels. So these are scientific levels at which we know that natural capital functions need to be at to remain, to continue to deliver ecosystem services. Things like clean air, clean water. They are aggregated up to a single index, which then gives a national picture of a country's status and trends towards true environmental sustainability. I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So this indicator framework we have trialed in a few countries so far. A PhD applied the framework to all EU member states. We've also trialed it in Kenya, Vietnam, New Caledonia, China, and Japan are ongoing. The new project that we are running at the moment is applying this indicator framework in South Africa and Colombia, particularly focusing on two challenges that we identified in previous pilots. So first of all, the challenge with biodiversity indicators and the fact that there are not internationally or nationally agreed scientific-based standards for biodiversity. And also the challenge of communicating the utility of this approach to environmental sustainability reporting to policymakers. So this is a 2-year funded project. We're about halfway through at the moment. And yes, I will speak a bit more, particularly about this project in relation to the biodiversity challenge and the public policy challenge.
Thank you. Lisa, it's up to you to present the strategic NBS framework. I will say the title.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're working on something we're calling the strategic NBS framework, which is really in response to kind of rapid urbanization and climate vulnerability, often in urban areas across Africa that have low data opportunities. So how can we're sort of testing, next slide, please. We're testing the potential for a rapid risk assessment looking at 3 indicators. So flooding, extreme heat, as well as ecological risks, and developing this citywide planning framework to help cities really understand what their risks are, where those risks are, and the potential for nature-based solutions to begin to address those risks. Next slide. So this research project, which we're about 3/4 of the way through, has sort of 3 or 4 stages. The first is really in our data analytics. So a big part of this was testing, how close can we get to the conditions on the ground related to these risks using primarily globally available data, and then contextualizing that with some local data. Understanding those needs related to flooding, extreme heat, and biodiversity, and then looking at those links together. So how do those sort of show up in adjacencies to each other, the composite needs mapping. Then using urban typologies to really understand what types of nature-based solutions are best in which locations. And so by combining those 2 mapping analyses sets, we can start to talk about what types of nature-based solutions are most appropriate across the city, and especially in those risk areas. This work has been sort of gone through a series of validation and engagements to test, what is this research showing? Is our analysis getting close to the understood risks on the ground? And then ultimately, this will lead to a strategic MBS framework guide that really identifies the methodology so that we can have many other cities to work on this. Currently, we're working in partnership, as Odile said, with Kigali and the young water professionals in Rwanda, and also in Addis Ababa with the Ethiopia Institute for Architecture and Building Construction and Development. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Nicolas?
Thank you. Buenas tardes. Mucho gusto estar con ustedes esta tarde. So yeah, good afternoon. I will say a few words about the ENSLAC initiative, which is another project of the ECOPRONAT program. And ENSLAC, we very focused on generating knowledge about NBS applied here in the region, especially in Peru, in Ecuador, and in Colombia. We want to understand what are the drivers of generating NBS implementation in our cities at large scale. We want to understand what are the drivers that makes some projects successful to be able to replicate them and to go further on. In this project, we are 3 partners. So ourselves based in Quito, so working especially in the cases of Ecuador. We have also a partner in Colombia, which is the Humboldt Institute, based in Bogota, and another partner in Lima, which is Ciudad Viva. We are the 3 of us specialized in NBS and their integration in cities. Next slide, please. So what we are looking, so the way we work in this ENSLAC project is analyzing 15 case studies, so 5 in each of the 3 countries. Those case studies are successful stories of green infrastructure or natural infrastructure or NBS projects in the cities. And we want to figure out what was the ingredients of a success. So that's why we are looking at their context, whether it is the technical, the natural, the urban context, the historical context, the political context. We are trying to understand what processes they put it in place to have those results, what governance tools and governance models they used, what impact have those initiatives today. And then the idea with all this information is trying to spread the voice to other municipalities, other cities that could then support new projects trying to reach the large scale.
Thank you, Nicolas. So 3 projects, different, but with a lot of similar things also, above all, because they are, for the 2 of you, based in urban cities, and a way to also help decision of public policies and so on. So now you presented that briefly, and thanks for that. Now, what I really want to know is how it happened, this research program, and how do you develop in your research across or multidisciplinary public action? What are the links between research and public stakeholders? So for you, Alison, can you explain what this strong sustainability approach first is? Because it's not so known, so it has to be explained. How it's based on a cross-disciplinary basis also, or public action, and how it establishes a link with public stakeholders and serves political decision-making.
Yes, definitely. So the strong sustainability approach is in contrast to the kind of approach that most countries take, which is a weak sustainability approach. So weak sustainability views natural capital as being possible to be traded off with other types of capital, like produced and social. So a country's wealth can continue to grow if the country is increasing the amount of capital. Natural capital, therefore, can be traded off with increases in social or produced capital, and a country's wealth normally tracked using an index like GDP will look to be going up. The strong sustainability approach views some functions of natural capital as not being possible to trade off if we are to continue living into perpetuity in a sustainable state. There are certain levels of ecological functions that must be maintained if the benefits that we derive from nature can continue to be enjoyed. So the ESCAP framework is composed of indicators that only indicators about the environment that have these scientific kind of evidenced values at which ecological functions have to be maintained so that benefits can continue to be enjoyed from the natural environment. It's quite unique in that regard because many indicator frameworks that are used for reporting are not also combined with these kind of reference levels. So there are, for example, policy targets for, say, how much forest cover a country might want to achieve or maintain, but these targets will be agreed through political processes. They will be informed by science, but they will also have other things coming into play. And reaching those targets might not necessarily mean that the environment can continue to function at a sustainable level. So I guess the unique selling point of the ESCAP is that you have this very unequivocal message about how far away from environmental sustainability a country truly is based on science-based targets. That means that we're limited by what indicators can be included because there are many things like biodiversity where there are not these agreed targets of sustainable levels. That's what makes the biodiversity indicators very tricky for the ESCAP and also an area of great interest for us. And we're focusing in our current project specifically on the biodiversity indicators that might be suitable, with some work to potentially consult with experts about what might be nationally or locally appropriate standards for biodiversity in South Africa and Colombia. So that will be a really interesting piece of work. What was the next question, Adil? Could you remind me?
How it's based on a cross-disciplinary public action and how it establishes a link with public stakeholder and decision-making.
Sure. So in terms of cross-disciplinary, it's very cross-disciplinary because the indicators actually come from, they represent a wide range of ecological functions. So we have indicators in there on water quality, eutrophication, forest utilization, air quality. So actually one of the big challenges of constructing this framework that we found in the pilots that we've done before is no one person knows technically enough information about all the topics to be able to do this on their own. You really need a cross-disciplinary team. And a lot of work that goes into the projects that we've done so far and are doing now is connecting with the experts in the countries that know about the data that's being collected on these particular indicators and what standards, if we're not going to use international standards, there are some international standards for the indicators such as the WHO air quality standards for human health. But there are other standards that vary across countries, particularly for ecological standards, because countries have very different ecological contexts. But it's useful in a way that it kind of brings together in one framework all these very different components of natural capital and the functions on which we depend on as humans. In terms of engagement with stakeholders, I think, yeah, part of what I just said already is very much part of the engagement with stakeholders is connecting with the data collectors and the experts in countries to really understand what data and standards are available for each country that we're working in. In terms of the public policy engagement, that's definitely one of the challenges we faced in the previous projects, is getting policymakers' attention in a crowded world of environmental reporting that they are already very embedded in, such as the SDG reporting, state of environment reporting that countries do. So trying to get the attention of policymakers to say, hey, there's this brand new framework of environmental reporting. It's very useful for you. You know, we need to work on that piece, and we are working on that piece. Like, why would policymakers want to engage in additional approach to environmental reporting? I will stop there.
Yeah. And having seen that, and in another panel with some decision makers, when you explain them what is the ESGAP and how it could function, they said, yeah, it could be a really interesting framework to help us to decide without knowing what is behind, because that is for scientists, but to help them to see where they are and how they can take decision would be a very interesting tool, I think. Thank you for that. So Lisa now. Lisa. In your research work in Kigali and Addis Abeba on NBS, how did you establish a link with public stakeholders and perhaps other stakeholders and also civil society?
Yeah, thank you, Odile. I think sort of building on what Alison was talking about, we all know there's sort of a challenge moving from research or planning towards implementation. And so this was a really important aspect of this strategic NBS framework research project, because we know that there are a number of different agencies, ministries, and government stakeholders who sort of own a piece of nature-based solutions implementation, operation, management within our urban or city conditions. And so it was really important to us to ensure that we were bringing a broad set of stakeholders together to talk through this project. As I mentioned, the idea was, can we know things are moving quite quickly in terms of climate impacts and the risks to very vulnerable populations and neighborhoods and communities. And so what we were trying to do is test how rapidly, right, can we actually develop a set of analyses that could help us hone in on those areas that are going to be most at risk across an entire city when there's not necessarily a full set of data sort of at present. So it was critical to begin to kind of break down silos by drawing that broad set of people together to early in our project, where we were just sort of having our initial outputs related to the flood modeling, which was a hydrologic modeling. It did not include hydraulic, right, the gray infrastructure, in order to do that rapidly. Extreme heat, so we were using surface temperatures from globally available data assessments. And then we were looking at biodiversity in sort of a unique way, with sort of enhancement of existing habitat areas and connectivity issues. And so by drawing this set of people together early on to look at the early outputs, draft outputs, and say, no, this isn't right, or this is right, was incredibly helpful to build kind of ownership, because ultimately the city stakeholders are the ones who are going to own this piece of work. And the hope is that they're going to embed it within public policies and sort of take it to the next phase. So the other thing that was interesting was drawing these multiple agencies together to look at the challenges together. So what we did was this composite mapping. So where is flooding, where is heat, and where is biodiversity opportunities, and how do those actually link together? What neighborhoods are going to be most important? And so you're sort of educating and integrating by sort of drawing them into this process of this composite mapping. In addition, I think, we have several touch points with the stakeholders and various levels of stakeholders. So we had sort of initial touch points in our early outputs. Then we did more of a validation set of workshops to ensure that the city and stakeholders were in agreement on the methodologies. And then we've gone even deeper into the priority areas that were selected by the stakeholders based on the analysis to actually dive into, what types of NBS projects could be explored. So that was incredibly helpful, right? To just keep them involved and really ultimately build the ownership from the city side. Thank you.
Yes, that's the words that I wanted to mention from what you are saying, how to build ownership, how to help inform the decision, how to build ownership. And so that's, and science working with people and with decision makers. Very good, very interesting. Nicola, I think that's more or less the same question on the basis of the 15 case studies that you have developed, that we presented briefly in your research. What are the key lessons that you have learned for establishing a link between research and public and private stakeholders. And I would add also community, because we saw some projects on Monday, and that's really a purpose.
Yes, yeah, we are pretty aligned, of course, with Alison and Liza. What we see, well, we always said when we talk about nature-based solution in cities that we lack local knowledge, no? And people say, yeah, it's nice to see what's happening in Europe or in the US, but here it's Ecuador and it's different. So we need somehow we need local knowledge, and we need to understand what can means this nature-based solution concept here with the local language, local context, local practices. So that's a bit what we try to understand with those 15 case studies. And yeah, looking at the ingredients. So yeah, of course, NBS are per se multidisciplinary. We need to understand yeah, all the aspects, from the environmental aspects, the urban aspects, the economy of the operation, the social aspects, the relationship between people and nature in the city, and yeah, all of this makes that we need to work in multidisciplinary team, and that's part of the thing that we are looking at also. And in the 15 case studies, what we've been observing is in those cases, the genesis of the projects is having different sources, different origins. Sometimes it comes from the community, sometimes it comes from the public authority, but all of them are following the same model in the terms of this multidisciplinarity and cooperation between private sector, public sector, and community. So we always have this three-party cooperation in the 15 cases, and we didn't select the cases for these particular things, but it happened that they are like this. And in this cooperation, we have also quite a lot of expertise, different expertise, and it's interesting to observe the roles of all of them, including the communities. In all the project, the community has taken an important role, which is specific to them. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see that, and it's probably quite specific to NBS, because in the urban planning, in the traditional urban planning processes, you usually have, yeah, the urban planner, the engineers, the municipalities around here, and nothing more. No, we don't talk about other things. So introducing nature in this process is very interesting, and it also opens the possibilities and the discussions toward other other thematics and other opportunities. Lilian.
Thank you. Before going further, I like what you, I like for sure what you say, but and we had a site visit on Monday, so we saw some of the project of Nicola, and that's really interesting to see also the work you are doing with community, and how you are, as you said, beginning with them in order to analyze the needs also, and building on that, as you said, with expertise, cooperation, and so on. So really interesting to see that. Before going further, I would open the discussion. So do you have any questions on this project? Yes, please. So can you say who you are, even if we all know you, and ask your question? So I see 2-3 questions now.
Thank you. Francesco Bino from GDN. Thank you for the presentations. Super interesting. Some of it I already knew, some I understand better now. You all talked about how you engage with local actors, right? And we all agree that, you know, this process is absolutely important. I just wanted to challenge you to go a little bit further in the discussion and share with us what you learned about the demand, local demand for what you're doing from those interactions. Thank you.
Who want to answer? No? No?
I can start. Great question. A lot, for sure, right? And I think what you're sort of asking is like, how has that influenced, right, the changes and direction? So in terms of the strategic NBS framework, I think that some of the challenges are sort of in some of our comments later on, but some of the challenges that were identified included other risks that were really important to the communities that weren't part of this framework yet. So what's really exciting is that we're just testing this framework. So there's a huge opportunity for us to add additional layers of analyses to this effort. So some of those included pollution, some of the pollution issues, both in terms of water, but also air. So air pollution was one that came up in our discussions, both in Kigali and in Addis Ababa, and which is really challenging because, of course, we're trying to develop these sort of rapid risk mapping, and there isn't a lot of data in terms of air pollution, and it doesn't fit within a city boundary. Obviously, none of these systems function on an administrative boundary, but air pollution is specifically very challenging to pinpoint and then sort of think about how you would actually address, particularly because the city stakeholders and local actors don't have the ability to necessarily govern some of the areas that are causing that problem. So that's just one example.
Yeah, 2 points about the demand. What we see is the demand from the community often is limited to being considered. Talking about what's happening in the region is being considered. So because often there is a kind of divorce between the communities and the municipalities, because the municipalities are facing difficulties to give an answer to all the requirements, all the things happening in the cities. So being considered and trying to, so when they see a group of experts going to them and trying to look at their place and to improve something, then the discussion starts, and we can go from the project we saw on Monday, for example. Communities were asking for paving streets, and so we start with that, but then we can start to discuss about nature, about trees, and the discussion can reach the demand that comes from the municipalities, that can be related to climate change, to the global challenges. So yeah, when doing the discussion, we can try to find a meeting point that can become a project. And this process is quite interesting, but yeah, it takes a little time. From what we saw in the NSLAC project also, is that the demand is, because some of those projects are quite old, some of them have been implemented 20 years ago, and when they were implemented for one objective, which was specific at that moment, and then the project evolved in time, and now we consider those projects as NBS project. It was not the same thing 20 years ago. But that's also because those projects have evolved, and now they are useful for the city, useful for the society, not only for one objective, but for several of them. So we have this multifunctionality, which is quite typical of the NBS, and that's also our interest in Slack to look at that. And yeah, it's interesting also to look at this evolution of the project along the years.
Another, yeah, please.
Hello, Marianne Kettunen, working with the Trade Development and the Environment Hub in the UK. 2 questions, crossing all the panelists. First, in the context of urban nature-based solutions, listening to you and based on what I know, it seems it's not the lack of ideas and good practice, but funding might be an issue. So I'm wondering whether you have some best practice or lessons learned to share how to access funding based on your work and experiences. And then Alison, for you, maybe I missed it, but I was wondering, are you working with or looking to work with some countries or regions already with your framework to test it moving forward?
Funding.
In the cases of NSLAC, fundings are quite diverse. But one point that is interesting is that most of those projects set up a specific governance that most of them are public, no? So public governance, but still it's not only public for most of them. And this particular governance on this particular organization gave them a kind of independence, including the economic independence, which is giving them autonomy and also longevity and quite an interesting stability, especially when you look at the local municipalities. There are always there's always a big turnover. Yeah, many changes happening, especially when administrations are changing. And most of those projects, even though they are attached to the public administration and also the public funds, they are having this stability. So that's also a nice point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that thinking about citywide implementation is, and that we've been talking with Kigali and Addis Ababa is, in design regulations. So particularly around new development, as there's a lot of, or redevelopment, where are the opportunities to actually begin to embed these designs so that you're really partnering with the private sector as one of those kind of strategies. And I think a lot of times the early projects really need that grant funding, right? So private funding to support or philanthropic funding to support so that communities and governments and other actors can really see the value. Yeah.
Marion, thank you very much for your question. So in terms of looking for other countries to test this going forward, so we have had quite a range of countries that we've now tested this in. So we've had LMIC countries, and we also have the EU member states and Japan and China. I think there's a desire from my team to be kind of engaging with initiatives that this is relevant to. The science-based targets for nature, that's a very relevant initiative. One part of the ESCAP, which we haven't piloted because it's harder to do, but potentially more interesting for policymakers, is another flavor of the ESCAP, which is the monetary ESCAP. So the ESCAP that we're testing, trialing, identifies the gap between the current biophysical states of environmental functions and the sustainable state of an environmental function. The monetary ESCAP calculates what would be the cost of closing that gap. So that's a very interesting area of future research, I think. So in terms of new projects, I think that would be a very interesting area to go to, is finding case studies or countries where we could further develop that index to really do those monetary calculations. Because I think that's very much what policymakers are interested in. It's not just what's the biophysical gap, but how much is it going to cost us to close that gap?
We will have one or two other period of questions. So is there any huge question, or we continue and you will have time after? That's okay? No, okay. So now let's go more in depth in what you are doing, and in order to know and to see how it's possible to integrate the multiple benefits of ecosystem services and biodiversity, in other words, to mainstream biodiversity into public policies based on what you did at national or local level, and once again to help decision making. Alison, drink. I wanted to know, how can the ESGAP approach support this? You told some things, but you can go further, yeah.
Definitely. In terms of specifically biodiversity and mainstreaming biodiversity, one of the things, we identify several challenges in this area through our ESGAP project. So first of all, there's really the consensus on metrics that countries are going to use for biodiversity reporting, which the Kunming-Montreal Protocol really sets a precedent for. There is also the big issue, which I have raised several times already, which is this lack of standards. So what are we aiming for when it comes to biodiversity? That's really tricky, because with biodiversity, you have so much local context when it comes to different species, different ecosystems. So probably like an international standard like we have for air pollution for humans, just like that's not appropriate for biodiversity. So countries probably need their own processes to develop appropriate standards for where they want to aim for when it comes to biodiversity, to have these functioning ecosystems that are able to maintain the delivery of ecosystem services benefits into perpetuity. As I said, we are exploring how to do that potentially in South Africa in this project with, we are talking about perhaps an expert elicitation activity. South Africa is an amazing place for biodiversity expertise. They have amazing institutions there that are also engaged in very relevant processes like natural capital reporting, accounting. So that will be a really interesting process for us to see, could expert elicitation help develop nationally appropriate biodiversity standards? In every country, there is a need for more systematic monitoring to biodiversity. That is also a big challenge we faced in all the countries where we've piloted the ESCAP, is the collection of biodiversity data is so patchy temporally and spatially, and this really limits countries' abilities to engage in something as rigorous as the ESCAP. And finally, I think capacity building within government. I mean, I can speak really only strongly about the UK, but the UK has really reduced their public expertise in ecology and biodiversity. But you need these expertise to be able to hold like developers, companies to account when it comes to actions on biodiversity. But if you don't have those expertise within the government, it's really difficult to have accountability. I'm going to leave it there.
So a good framework is useful, but data, as we always say, capacity, as you were saying, raising awareness, I guess, in order to influence and to the decision-making and the public policies with such a global, if I can say, framework. If we go to perhaps more practical, if I can say, examples like yours, Lisa, based on what you've done in Kigali and Addis Abeba and the development of this strategic framework, how does it influence, or are you trying to, I don't know, the public policies of these two cities in order to incorporate this framework in what they are deciding to do in the cities? Because that's really a challenge, I guess.
It is a challenge in a short period. As we know, this type of work takes a lot of time. But I think one of the positives is that we have sort of city sponsors in each city. So in Addis Ababa, the Urban Beautification and Greening Bureau is really taking ownership of this process. And so we know that this strategic MBS framework will kind of live on. And because the policy development and plan approval processes can be very lengthy, it's great to know that there's an entire agency that's, supporting this work and will kind of steward it into the future. In Kigali, the Chief Resilience Officer has been our sponsor, and so that's a really strong connection to the mayor's office, where there's an incredibly ambitious sort of resilience plan by Kigali. So I think we've set ourselves in a good position to ensure that this research project, moves towards implementation through policy in the future. I do think there are a number of challenges too, of course, and some of that is really just the fact that biodiversity doesn't follow administrative boundaries, right? So we know that the city of each of these cities isn't responsible for the complete management and protection of those sort of natural areas that already exist, and the connectivity of those areas within the larger ecosystems and watersheds. So that requires partnerships, and those are long-term development sort of processes that within our research project, we won't be able to dive deeply into. So as a result of our research, we will be presenting a action plan, a sort of recommended action plan. And so there'll be a number of steps that we hope these sponsors will be able to sort of shepherd into the future. I also just wanted to note that one of the, I think, biggest challenges is biodiversity is not a simple thing to assess. So it's very complex. It has multi-layers in terms of habitat, in terms of, sort of the flora and fauna, but also species that are relying on that habitat. Water is connected to it. So it's a complex system that is changing all the time. And the amount of data at any given point is not necessarily very deep. So the way that we've been thinking about biodiversity is really in two kind of categories at this rapid risk assessment. One being the sort of protection and enhancement of existing habitat areas, ensuring that we're creating buffer zones that are not going to sort of encroach in existing habitat. And also understanding the potential linkages. So where are there connectivity opportunities to really build habitat corridors for plants and animals? And this work was really informed by the Singapore Biodiversity Index, but that looks at an entire city, not sort of spatially across a city. So, we've taken a couple indicators that we feel are supportive and also link to the potential for flood management as well as extreme heat management. And so kind of creating that connectivity and helping all stakeholders to understand their linkages, is sort of what we hope to leave this research with. So thank you.
I will go directly to Nicola, and I think I have a question for you both. Same question, Nicola, for you, with an emphasis on territorial planning in Latin America. In Latin America cities, based on your case studies.
Yes, in the case studies of the NSLAC project, so we have 15 case studies, quite a lot. So we have interesting services provided by nature. It's quite interesting to see providing food, providing water to large cities, preventing landslides, providing air quality and so on. So it's quite interesting to see these services, and most of them are quite evident now because most of the projects are well established and strong. They are large-scale projects. But if we look at the origin of those projects, I mean, it wasn't the case at the beginning. So all those projects to become large and to go towards this large scale and somehow to mainstream what they did. They had to make a specific effort, so to generate awareness, to convince people. So it's quite interesting to look at that specifically, the leadership, the convincing people. And for example, there are we were talking about the funding. No, for example, there are two examples of MERESE. I don't know if you know the MERESE mechanism in Peru, which is a payment for ecosystem services. And MERESE especially applied for the water funds to provide water to the cities on the coast, especially Lima, and the water comes from the mountain 100 kilometers away. So they are paying people to keep the water in those areas in the mountains so that the water can arrive months later in the cities. No, and so those are whole mechanisms, quite interesting, and they became regulations. So now there is a national regulation about MERESE, and that's an example of how local initiative that has explored a model of funding then became sufficiently interesting and powerful to generate a new legislation that is now generating other initiatives like that. No? So those pioneer projects are interesting also for that because they were strong enough to generate those kind of things. Some of them also were able to influence the political agenda of the city or to be associated to international cooperation, and they got stronger because of that also. So it's not all the case, but most of the cases are associated to the global agenda of the cities. And I talk about the governance aspect with this triangle of cooperation that is systematic and probably support a lot the capacity to mainstream those initiatives.
Yeah, there is a question of scientific knowledge, of basis, of raising awareness of people, but also integration in decision making. And I would perhaps ask you, Lisa, and perhaps you, Nicola, also another question. But what about, and perhaps more for you, the research program is there, developed for some years. What about after? What we will go to the third question, to the main condition to scale up and so on. But in your precise case, you are not a consultant, so it's a longer term project. But nevertheless, when it will be finished, how will you ensure, and perhaps for you also, that it will continue and it won't be a several project ended up because you are away, you are gone? Yes. So what are the conditions for that? What are you doing for that? And you
Yeah,
too.
well, I think similar, to what I mentioned before, is having the stakeholder ownership in the city. So having these project sponsors are key, but also WRI has teams on the ground working in these cities, and so our partners and our WRI colleagues, sort of are continually working with the city on many of these issues. So I think there's a real opportunity to both sort of support future actions that are recommended, and we'll see how that's sort of taken up. Our next step is actually in December we'll be working towards what we're calling the action workshops, where we'll go back to the stakeholders with some of the project concepts, sort of programmatic ideas, and implementation strategies, and test whether they resonate, and ensure that we're sort of setting steps along with sort of owners of those steps to move forward. So that's our hope, is that it will be able to continue through that work. In addition, the strategic MBS framework, we hope we'll have the opportunity to test in other localities too, and see what we can learn from different environments. Specifically, we're really interested in exploring, a coastal environment, which is quite different from these two areas, but even in different parts of the globe. So that would be kind of next steps. Does that help get to your question?
Yes, in our case, so we have, I mean, that's part of our question, how to spread the voice, how to convince people, how to demonstrate that NBS can be used now in our cities, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru. So in the project, we have local committees in the 3 countries. We are using the fact that the French Development Agency is funding the project, and there are AFD agency in each of the countries. So we are cooperating with the local agencies to be able to identify and talk to local stakeholders at municipal level and national level, so that we can transfer this knowledge. I mean, it's interesting to have this knowledge for the 3 of us, the three research partners, but we know it's not enough. And the project is here to generate new knowledge, local knowledge, and to be able to diffuse it locally. So the last 6 months of the project next year will be dedicated to this diffusion process. So either on the scientific aspect, because it's a research project, but then also on the local, political, and technical level, to ensure that those examples that are quite well known actually, but need further visibility and need to be integrated also, need to be associated to this NBS concept, which is new in town, and but actually it's new, but there are examples that can inspire us, and when we are looking for local example, we can find true inspiration there. So that's the message we want to transmit, and we are still looking for the best way to do that, to do this transmission, and we will try several ways. Hopefully it works.
That's a real issue to be sure that it will be maintained in the future. Alison, it's a bit different, but and you are at an early stage of development, but what would you imagine in order to also, imagine that countries are using the ESCAP with you in your research work, you are living, what will happen? So how can you imagine now, even if it's a bit early, to be sure that they will continue to help this tool? Sorry, it's a bit early, but it's important to think about this also.
Thanks, Odile. In my experience, particularly in Vietnam and Kenya, where we had partners in the countries that were embedded in the government, they were technical teams, but they had the ear of policymakers. And the engagement with the project with them, it sparked a lot of excitement in the technical teams, because I think it really raised their awareness about the use and importance of science-based standards and how these are different from policy-based standards, and what that means if you're aiming for a science-based standard. And also highlighting gaps in national data collection, which also excited them. And they very much had the technical capacity already in Vietnam and Kenya to engage in building the framework, but they were limited when there were data gaps. It was very much then them getting the policymakers interested, which was like the challenge we really noticed in those projects. And I think even though we got the technical teams excited, once we left, you know, they're interested, but they can't continue the work because they haven't got buy-in from the rest of the government. So I think that's what we're trying to work on now in this current project in Colombia and South Africa, is how to make then that jump between the technical teams and the government and then the policymakers, of really getting the interest of policymakers about how this kind of approach could inform decision-making. So that's things like communication about the ESCAP can produce one index comparable to GDP. Like, policymakers love having a single number. It also, with the 20 indicators, shows where a country might want to prioritize their actions in terms of recovering natural capital functions to a sustainable level. It's about communicating how the ESCAP is complementary to and adds additional value to what the countries are already doing in terms of environmental reporting to the SDGs and their own internal reporting in the CBD. So I think that's what we need to do, I think, is like getting the correct message communicated to the people with power, that this is a useful way for them to inform decision making. And we haven't cracked that nut yet. This is what we're doing. This is very much the live project work at the moment.
From a technical tool to a political tool.
Yeah.
More or less. So I will open for a second session of Q&A. Don't ask questions about the scale up of NBS, because that will be the third question. But if you have any question of what you heard for now, please, the floor is yours. Any question?
Hi, Stefan Simis, Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the United Kingdom. Wanted to touch on another last points you just made, Alison. When you have this large stack of indicators and policymakers want to know what is the next best step to get to a higher score, basically, how do you deal with the fact that many of the indicators are probably quite interconnected? Or are they not?
So I think there is a logical flow within the ESCAP. So we could get very technical quite quickly, so I will try not to. So there are 4 main parts of the ESCAP. So we call it the life, 4 main functions within which we have several indicators. So the life support function is really kind of like at the bottom, you know, that's what's supporting everything. We have sink indicators and source indicators. So sink is like those pollution ones, and sources, things like timber extraction. And then we have the human health indicators. So you could see how the life support function indicators, you know, you need biodiversity at a critical level. You need ecosystems in a good condition to be able to support the ecosystem functions that then are able to act as a source and a sink and a human health and well-being support. So it's kind of structured, they're all at the same level. So in a way, the framework highlights that there are multiple components to environmental sustainability. But I don't know how well we deal with that connectedness yet. And it would be really interesting to talk actually to you more if this is an area that you're interested in. About what you think about that challenge.
Any other question? That's the occasion, you know. So perhaps we can come, if there is no other question, we can go to the third of my questions. And that's about scaling up. What we've seen is that these are specific projects in specific cities, sometimes small projects. And now how to go from this small project to more important in terms of surface and so on, integration of NBS in the way to manage biodiversity, sometimes also, not sometimes, but very often also climate issues and with social issues, because we spoke a lot of the link with the community and so on. So that's really another vision in any local decision. So what are your advice based on your research work, based on your case studies, to scale up and to go to more important aspect of this NBS? I don't know. You want to begin? Is that okay?
Sure. So in terms of cities, I think it's always a very unique condition because cities tend to be built up, right? So we're talking about ecosystems within very largely built up areas. These are highly altered conditions, right? So we're sort of retrofitting, and I think that by its nature is incredibly challenging, right? And we're crossing different ownership categories and land use types. But I think that in terms of what I would call institutionalization of nature-based solutions in urban areas, I think there's a number of things that are kind of critical to build on. And the first is creating a vision. So, I think we often use policy in order to set sort of goals, and that vision helps to drive change, right? In addition, I think it's really important to understand the needs, what is the status of existing nature within the city, natural conditions, and that includes both, city parks, but also habitat areas, remnant habitat areas. It includes street trees, right? And habitat corridors. It includes private spaces as well as public spaces. And thinking about all of those in a sort of systematic way is critical to understanding what sort of what is the makeup of the current nature within the city. Then I think that's really important to kind of balance a set of tools, both sort of regulatory, thinking about the requirements that cities can make to ensure that we have more natural systems and nature, that we're protecting what already exists, we're enhancing as needed what has been degraded, and that we're building in the right locations. Also, I think it's critical to think about incentives. So how are we sort of incentivizing folks, either through partnerships, but really drawing in potential both funding, but also resources, capacity. And then I think it's kind of critical to kind of build into a set of technical guidelines. What do we mean by nature-based solutions in your city? I think there are many beautiful and wonderful kind of global, kind of documents or even sort of regional documents, but ultimately in cities, nature-based solutions are very context specific. And then it's sort of building out the institutional arrangements, like how are these spaces governed? How are they managed? How are they operated? How are they improved? And then finding ways to actually embed this work into, current city budgets, as well as sort of the private funding. So what I've seen really successful in terms of urban sort of scaling of an institutionalization of nature-based solutions is starting with pilots, starting with small projects that, you can mess up and try something, see what it looks like and improve the next time. And that's, kind of a critical way to begin this work. As I think, Nicolas definitely talked a lot about, If you don't have the community on board, you know, it's great to have politicians sort of pushing something, but I think that has to be a true partnership and a demand from communities to have, you know, more nature around and understanding of why that's going to be supportive for livelihoods, for economy, and for mental and physical health. And then I think that sort of having a strategic sort of approach at the city level that includes kind of projects, you know, specific spatial projects that can be delivered, and more like a policy-based approach that is your regulations and incentives, as well as kind of programmatic work. So using policy to set guidelines around urban tree canopy or access to open space and things like that that can really support the development. So those are some ideas.
Nicolas?
Yes, so from the ENSLA cases and also from our experience in Ecuador, what we see is that the cities tend to follow a kind of process towards the ecological transition, and nature-based solutions are part of this transition. And in this process, we have several steps, no? And sometimes the cities are following all the steps, and at other moments they just go towards one, no, and focused on one. So the first one is to generate data. No, we are really missing data in the region. We are not even sure how many people are living in Quito because the last census was done in 2010, for example. It was renewed last year, but the new census is very criticized because it looks like it is incomplete. So we lack data and we need data. And interestingly, some cities are starting now in the country to do their urban tree inventory. So it gives a new knowledge, which is super interesting for the city in terms of nature in the city. Because with that, we know how many trees we have, what they are, what is their state, and then we can define interesting plans. So data is key. Then defining strategies is also important. So making green infrastructure plans, climate action plans, biodiversity plans, because it helps to make the link between the global agenda, the great challenges, and the local context, no, and to define a vision, which is often a long-term vision, so that you can then define some specific actions around that. It's also important to publish knowledge. No, we see that especially in the NBS world, the guidance and information has been really exploding in the last years, but mostly coming from Europe, and still people are quite skeptical of the applicability of those solutions from over there to here. So we still need to generate our own local specific guidance and so on, to generate awareness and to develop the how-to, no, to develop the process. Parallelly to that, we still have to develop quite a lot the knowledge and the know-how and the expertise, because most of the time with the NBS in the cities, we are competing with the gray infrastructure, and the gray infrastructure is well structured. There is all the engineering part, which is well established. We are able to say this will be the flow of water there. This solution has this capacity. It costs this and so on. And still, we are not able to do that with green infrastructure, not to be so precise. And so, yeah, guarantee of the thing. So we have still to evolve with this knowledge and this capacity to also to put numbers on the thing. We are super convinced in Yes Innovation that we have to go through small steps, and we have to allow to experiment in the city. Sometimes it's difficult, especially to convince the municipalities to experiment. But I mean, the small scale, the small implementation is super important to be able to then to go larger, and yeah, being a bit more secure about what can be the right solution. So this experimentation is key, and urban labs, for example, are super interesting models to try new solutions like NBS. We see also that it's important then to identify local barriers. So in one of the visits that we did on Monday, we were talking about small, let's say, low-level practices that were totally not aligned with the great agenda, the great strategy of the city. And because of those practices, some very practical point like not having the database with nature-based solutions in the database, just avoid that database are arriving in a project to modify a small place or a street. So those kind of things, or specific regulation at neighborhood level, that's the case we faced in one of the examples we've been seeing, are just avoiding the things to happen, even if there is a great willingness to change many things in the great agenda. It does not happen because of very specific things that we have to identify. Then, yeah, we talk about the communities, and it's key to work with the communities, and especially to give them a role, so that they can feel part of the process, and not only to give their opinion and then the process is following. So we have to find this figure, and it's not easy, but when the role of the community is well defined and it's part of the process, often the things are working quite nicely, and that's what we are observing in the Slack cases. And the last point is starting again with the data. So it's about monitoring the actions, monitoring the green infrastructure we have. So that's also part of the work that we are doing in Slack, to be able to show what means nature-based solution in our cities, to show that it's possible to have these kind of solutions, that those solutions are giving interesting results, and that we can apply them just here and now. Yeah.
Thank you. I have some ideas of questions, but yes, I prefer you to ask some questions. So I see 2 people, 3 people.
Yeah, thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I just want to know, how does this model, you deal with the transformative changes, particularly with regard to MBS, if you would like to share?
So the transformative model you said for the implementation of NBS in the cities? Yeah, I mean, naturally, what we observe in the cities is that there is a lot of inertia. I mean, yeah, the old processes are always coming again and again. So we are facing this, let's say, gray to green transition that is not happening because of many reasons. Also because of the past, and because of the message on the knowledge from the past. So that's the first difficulties, but then we are also facing the difficulties that I understand you mentioned, that is also integrating the complexity of the green, understanding how this is evolving in time, how this is has the capacity to help us to face climate change and all the evolutions where there are many things that we don't know, and this is also a great part of the question that we still have. And for a practical example, for example, we are in a project of green infrastructure we are doing in a city in the south of Ecuador. We are asked which kind of tree species we have to implement, and we are talking about native or not native, but we see also that the climate is changing. We are not sure about the climate scenario for these cases. For this case, so we try to send the message that we also have to experiment somehow, and maybe some species that we can mention today won't be the right one, because of this process of evolution that we are facing, the natural one and also the one from the city itself. So yeah, I mean, that's part of the things we have to deal with.
Yeah, I might just add, I think what I'm hearing is, the adaptability of nature-based solutions to a changing climate, a changing development world, and urban condition. And I think that's one of the benefits of nature and natural systems is this sort of ability to increase, reduce, change, plant new species, integrate new species, and in complete contrast to gray infrastructure, which once it's built, it has a certain performance basis. And so when things change, it's very difficult to actually adjust or modify. So I think, agreeing with Nicholas's points, and also just noting that I think it's one of the huge benefits that we have this opportunity to expand or detract a wetland, right? Based on what is, happening within the city and what the needs are in terms of heat attenuation, stormwater management, and the ecological conditions, related to the climate change.
Those are questions.
First of all, thank you very much. It was interesting. I understood a lot, and now I have a question. Lisa, you have been working in Addis Ababa. I used to live in Hawassa, if you know Hawassa in southern Ethiopia. There, I also participated in master plan development with the city of Hawassa 10 years ago. Recently, I went to the same city because I'm doing research also on how urbanization affecting this biodiversity landscape in the surrounding areas in the context of rural-urban interfaces. I observed that they are changing green spaces to building areas. This is done by the administrators or the city administrators themselves. And I tried to talk to them. Accessing them was very difficult, maybe because I'm also an Ethiopian. Did you talk to really the decision makers? And is it really their priority to work in this line of research that you have done? There's the real thing behind it is also governance, priorities, interests, power issues, so many things. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so we have talked with government, and by we, not myself. So our team who's in Addis Ababa, I have been in some of the meetings, but that connection is made from our local partners. And in the discussions that I was present in with several of the ministries, so Ministry of Water, Ministry of Roads, Ministry of Wastewater, Ministry of Parks, the Botanical Gardens, and many others, there was a definite interest. Of course, as you know, being from Ethiopia, administrations change frequently and priorities change frequently. So within the time frame of this work and some of the earlier kind of seed work that led to the strategic MBS framework, within the city of Addis Ababa, there was 4 administration changes, which meant there were 4 different sets of stakeholders that we were working with. So I take your question very, very seriously, and I appreciate it, because I think there is a huge challenge. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on this. So one of my sort of hopes through this work is that by actually focusing in on specific neighborhoods that we've identified as priorities, and connecting with both the local administration leaders by Wareda and the local community, that sort of ownership can be maintained, rather than the sort of the city and national government, which is typically sort of making larger scale decisions. And my hope is that those projects find legs so that the city can really see the benefit. So the Urban Greening and Beautification Bureau, which is our partner and lead from the city, is very much in line with this and has committed a lot of both their staff time, their technical staff time, as well as the director has been really involved. But again, we know that there is a rapidly changing environment there. So it will be a challenge, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes. I hope that helped answer. You have something more? Yes.
They came to build house in a green area behind my house.
Yes.
And the local communities.
Yes, you.
We mobilize ourselves.
Yes.
And start to pay the study for our people. I didn't want to pay it, but the community that we say that same time. I think you have been there for some years.
A few years, yes.
Yeah, it was 6 months that this happened. The same thing, the same authorities.
Yes. They took it over. Yes. I'm sorry to hear about that experience. I think, you know, another experience there, you know, we've been looking at this, the convergence of the Akaki River and the Little Akaki River. And there is a significant amount of locally owned farmland, I'm not sure, but locally run farmland, right? And which now is a dumping ground for much of the construction work, right? But also it's a new business because they're mining the sand, right? The sediment that comes down for the construction. So there's definitely these local economies of scale that have some level of potential for particularly for, you know, restoration of these areas and protection of these areas. But it is a super challenge. I completely understand that the challenge. So it's like small steps. I think with Addis, they're very interested. We just get some pilots so that, you know, so people can kind of see and hope that that will inspire more people in communities like yours. Thank you for the question.
Any other question?
It's not a question. I just want to share, since Nicola discussed about the payment for ecosystem services. In India, we have been working quite a lot on payment for ecosystem services, particularly the mountain states. One of the states called Himachal Pradesh has already, you know, developed a policy for payment for ecosystem services. A pilot has been done. You know, a community was earmarked and paid about INR 5,000 for, you know, keeping up the forest ecosystem so that it provides clean air, clean water, you know, substantiated groundwater for down the line communities. The policy is being built around, you know, such initiatives only, that down the line cities should be able to pay, should be willing to pay for the ecosystem services extended. So I think there needs to be a submergence with the sync within the policy at all levels to get the payment for ecosystem services done. Just wanted to share.
Thank you very much. Voy a traducir en inglés mi pregunta un ratito. In order to convince policymakers, it's often necessary to provide evidence and information. In the SBN models that you have promote, have you done any kind of cost benefits analysis?
Yeah, that's part of the work we try to do. So we try to assess the impact of those projects, and yeah, it's not the easiest part because we depend on the existing data, no, and surprisingly, most of those projects don't have a solid monitoring process. And often the data is very focused on specific objectives that they had initially. I'm thinking, for example, for the AgroPar project in Quito, which was born 25 years ago, focusing on malnutrition, on desnutrition, and that's very focused. And now, if you look at this AgroPar project, it's for food provision, but it's also for many other things. But still they have only indicators on this part. So sometimes the cost benefit is quite difficult to assess, because you understand that yeah, having those many families having a small agricultural production in the city is interesting for the food, but then it's also interesting for the neighborhood, for the land, because you have pieces of green in many places in the city, but we don't have measures of that now. So yeah, that's part of the thing, the job we try to do, and we understand the importance of that, to share the voice and to convince the people of the effect, to be able to put figures, but yeah, we try to do that.
Isa, are you doing any cost benefit analysis?
We are not doing
You are
cost
not.
benefit. We're relying on other cost benefit analysis as of research, existing literature. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I didn't see any chat information, but it's time. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's time to close this this side event. Thanks a lot to all the three panelists. I just wrote some words. It's, in fact, it's a bit complicated to summarize, and it's but I think it's really, really interesting to see, and I'm really happy to see that the research we are financing is helpful for that, to see that science is helping to take decision, is helping decision maker, or could help decision maker to take very different decisions, with a lot of challenges, as you all said, because convince a political man, very often, or woman, that its gray infrastructure can be replaced by a green one. It's a challenge. First of all, because during the inauguration event, it's much better to see a good wastewater treatment plant than small herbs and so on. It's not so easy, and that's why your question was also important. You have to test. It has to be informed by science, but it has also to work and to convince people by measuring impacts and so on, that is good, that it's perhaps better than others, or can be another solution. And that's regarding climate change, flood events, fooding also, population. It can be one way, or for the future, because of the climate change, evolution, and biodiversity loss, and so on. So thanks a lot for that. And for that, we need also framework to measure everything and to help, no, really, I'm convinced, and to help the decision making, summarizing these different things and taking into account biodiversity, but also social purposes, as you are all mentioning here, and above all in such countries. So thanks a lot to all. Thanks a lot to you first. We can applaud them. And bye-bye.